The leaves and the ground were as wet as water could make them. We endeavored to get fire by flashing powder on the leaves. But this failing, we were forced by old master necessity to lay down with 3 other of our constant companions: fatigue, hunger, and cold. Private Joseph Plum Martin.
One week before Christmas, 1777, the 10,000 weary men of George Washington's army marched into the rolling hills of southeastern Pennsylvania to a place called Valley Forge. 1 in 3 was unfit for duty.
Men without clothes to cover their nakedness, without blankets to lay on, without shoes. Their marches might be traced by the blood from their feet marching through frost and snow. George Washington.
Cloth tents could not protect the men from the brutal winter, so they began to clear the forest to build huts. From Valley Forge, Washington could keep an eye on the British 21 miles away in Philadelphia. And a winter encampment in a remote place without distractions was exactly what the commander-in-chief needed. Washington meant to forge a real army this winter, disciplined and uniformed, men who would not retreat at the sight of a bayonet. He wanted an army like the English had.
One of the ironies of Washington was that he was rather pro-British. And he wasn't pro-British politically, obviously. He tried to model the Continental Army along the lines of a traditional European army. So he was a conventional 18th century thinker.
Harsh discipline was routine. At Valley Forge, a court-martial sat nearly every day. An officer caught stealing had his sword broken over his head in front of his company. Deserters received 100 lashes for the first offense, and the punishment would be drawn out for days. The men repeatedly ignored the rules of sanitation. Washington finally had to issue an order that any man caught relieving himself anywhere but at the latrines would be court-martialed.
Washington knew that he had to be tough. He had to call in the men who were willing to do the things they need to do to keep a 18th century army in line. And that even means executing men when you have to in order to make sure that they understand that the rules are the rules.
One of the factors about whippings, the floggings that were used as punishments in armies and navies of the 18th century is that you are inflicting a very, very painful surface wound that will leave a permanent scar so that people will know you had misbehaved, but that don't permanently disable the individual, because then he's no good as a sailor or a soldier.
Washington had only 3 months to mold an army before spring arrived and the fighting resumed. On February 23, 1778, a foreign volunteer appeared in Washington's camp. The 47-year-old Baron Friedrich Wilhelm Ludolf Gerhard Augustin von Steuben introduced himself as a general and former aide-de-camp to King Frederick of Prussia, the greatest military mind of the age. Von Steuben claimed to be an expert at teaching military drill, but he asked for no pay and no rank until he proved himself. Impressed with von Steuben's credentials, Washington gave him the title of Acting Inspector General and the monumental task of training the American Army. The units of each state marched differently. They had no standard procedure for handling weapons. Their muskets were rusted. Barely half had bayonets, and most of those were used as spits to cook meat when they had meat to cook. Von Steuben, more impressed with the rebel spirit than with their discipline, wrote to a friend in Europe,
You say to your soldier, do this, and he does it. But I am obliged to say, this is the reason why you ought to do that. And then he does it.
Although von Steuben could curse in 3 languages, he couldn't speak English. Every night he wrote out the next day's orders in German. Then his aide translated them into French, and a French-speaking American translated them into English.
The right wheel, march. Right.
By the end of winter, von Steuben delivered what he promised, a closely drilled army. Yet he turned out to be an imposter. He was neither a baron nor a general. In fact, he had left the military 14 years earlier after rising no higher than captain. George Washington didn't care. Von Steuben had performed a miracle. He was promoted to Major General. Well into spring, the men were still hungry, half naked, and plagued by diseases, dysentery, smallpox, fevers, tormenting rashes. Surgeon Albigen's Waldo summed it up.
Poor food, hard lodging, nasty clothes, nasty cookery, vomit half my time, the devil's in it.
By early May 1778, 2,000 men had died in camp. 2,000 more had deserted.
The amazing thing to me is that these people deserted in such small numbers. People generally point out 1 in 10 deserted at Valley Forge. One is questioned, is tempted to ask the question, what kept the other 9 around?
I think the soldiers of the Revolution suffered the privations and the hardships because of peer pressure. I think that was the major factor. Bottom line is your buddy in the mess, the guy that you cook this measly portion with and stand out in the rain with. That's going to be the real key to putting up with something as long as they did.
On May 5th, incredible news arrived at Valley Forge to cheer the soldiers. France had joined them in the war.
Benjamin Franklin in Paris had signed agreement with the French government to enter into alliance with the Americans for so long as the struggle took against the British. And this meant so much this was in a sense a decisive event in the war, this diplomatic revolution, this diplomatic victory, which immensely heartened and put a moral inspiration not only into the soldiers but into the population.
At Valley Forge, the soldiers marched and wheeled amid loud cheers for the King of France.
What spectacle can you imagine more splendid than an army of free men drawn up within hearing of their enemy to celebrate the interment of tyranny and the coronation of independence?
Washington is certainly a most surprising man that he should, with a ragged, undisciplined people, so long keep a British general at bay. It is astonishing. General Howe, a man brought up to war from his youth, to be puzzled and plagued for 2 years by a Virginia tobacco planter. O Britain, how thy laurels tarnish, an American loyalist.
In October of 1777, a few days after the disaster at Saratoga, the British commander in America, General William Howe, asked to be relieved of what he called this very painful service. He then spent a festive winter in Philadelphia with his American mistress. Their affair became so notorious that it was mocked in a popular song.
Sir William, he, snug as a flea, lay all this time a-snoring, nor dreamed of harm as he lay warm in bed with Mrs. Loring.
In May, Howe's replacement finally arrived.
General Henry Clinton was a very unfortunate character. He had wanted high command, but he got it at the stage when the British were actually recognizing that America was just one theater amongst many in this war that had broadened into a global struggle. He was rather lacking in confidence in himself. He was a complex character. Many people have said that he was ideally suited to be a second in command.
As a French fleet approached America, Clinton was ordered to evacuate Philadelphia and concentrate his army in New York. On June 16th, 3,000 Loyalists, along with 2 regiments of Hessian mercenaries who might desert on a march, left the city by ship. The rest of the army, 10,000 men, set out overland with a year's worth of plunder.
The number of wagons employed to carry the baggage and provisions were amazing. The wagons extended 12 miles in length. The movements were, of course, slow. Loyalist Judge Thomas Jones.
As the British retreated, Washington saw a rare chance to fight them on his terms. On the night of June 27th, he caught up with the British near Monmouth, New Jersey. After a council of war, he decided to attack. Following protocol, Washington gave the honor of leading the charge to his second-in-command, General Charles Lee, ironically the most outspoken opponent of this attack.
Major General Charles Lee is one of the more colorful characters on any side in the Revolutionary War. He had apparently a very squeaky type of voice, so he got on people's nerves that way. He also firmly believed that when God had created Charles Lee, he had achieved the pinnacle of success and nobody else was ever going to come close.
Lee wanted to be commander-in-chief himself. He considered Washington, in his words, not fit to command a sergeant's guard. On the hot, muggy morning of June 28th, Lee, with half the army, struck. Twice the British counterattacked. Twice they were beaten back. Then Lee began issuing a series of confused orders.
One order succeeded another with a rapidity and indecision calculated to ruin us. A regiment was ordered to form behind the fence and is speedily commanded to retire. All this disgraceful retreating. Colonel John Lawrence.
You have in Charles Lee an officer who missed Valley Forge, who missed the entire 1777 campaign. He made decisions at Monmouth based on the way he last remembered the American army fighting, not on what that American army was capable of doing.
A young fifer ran into Washington, bringing up the main army. When the fifer reported that Lee was retreating, the commander-in-chief had him arrested for spreading rumors. But then entire regiments began streaming past him. Washington spurred his horse straight toward the battlefield.
We had not retreated far when the commander-in-chief crossed the road. I heard him ask our officers by whose order the troops were retreating. And being answered by General Lee's, he said something, but he was too far off for me to hear it distinctly. Those who were near him said that his words were, "Damn him." Private Joseph Plum Martin.
Washington had always struggled to control his temper. When he spotted General Lee riding away from the battle, he lost it.
It was on a day that would have made any man swear. Yes, sir, he swore on that day, till the leaves shook on the trees. Never have I enjoyed such swearing before or since. General Charles Scott.
Only 200 yards from the British, Washington personally halted the retreat and rallied the men.
He rode all along the lines amid the shouts of the soldiers, cheering them by his voice and example, and restoring the fortunes of the fight. Never had I beheld so superb a man. The Marquis de Lafayette.
The British pressed their attack. This time, the Continentals stood their ground.
Monmouth is one of the bigger battles that's fought in the Revolution in terms of numbers of men on both sides engaged. And it's a battle that's fought almost exclusively with regulars. So it's really regular against regular. It's the test. How well did Steuben train? Because it's pretty much an even-up contest. You see, time after time after time, when they sit there and duke it out, the American unit cracks the British unit.
The cruelest foe on the field was the blistering heat, well over 100 degrees.
We're talking about a record heat wave, and not just a record heat wave, a humid heat wave. There are more casualties in some units of men dying from heat stroke than were killed in some of the units. It was a devastating day to try to fight in.
Women known as Molly Pitchers carried water to cool both the men and the cannons. When one, Mary Ludwig Hayes, saw her husband go down, she rushed in herself, 7 months pregnant, and took his place.
A cannon shot from the enemy passed directly between her legs, carrying away all the lower part of her petticoat. Looking at it with apparent unconcern, she observed that it was lucky it did not pass a little higher, for it might have carried away something else. Joseph Plum Martin.
George Washington was burning to launch a counteroffensive, but the setting sun thwarted his hopes. Clinton now did to Washington what Washington had twice done to the British. He slipped away during the night. The longest battle of the war ended in a draw, but Washington's army, drilled in the snows of Valley Forge, proved itself in the heat of Monmouth. In the summer of 1778, George Washington triumphantly moved his headquarters to White Plains, New York, the scene 2 years earlier of his army's defeat and retreat. Private Joseph Plum Martin walked the old battlefield. Crude, shallow graves no longer concealed the skeletons of former enemies.
Here were Hessian skulls. Poor fellows. They were left unburied in a foreign land. They should have kept at home, but the reader will say that they were forced to come and be killed here, forced by their rulers who have absolute power of life and death over their subjects. Well then, bless the kind providence that has made such a distinction between your condition and theirs.
Now other foreign soldiers, French soldiers, were coming to risk their lives on American shores. But their admiral, the Comte d'Estaing, had taken 12.5 weeks to cross the Atlantic, nearly a month longer than the average journey. If d'Estaing had arrived just a few days earlier, he would have caught the British fleet outside New York Harbor and might have ended the revolution that summer. When Washington learned the heavy French vessels could not enter New York's shallow harbor, he gave up hope of capturing the city. D'Estaing offered him a consolation prize. He would attack the British garrison at Newport, Rhode Island. For the first Franco-American campaign, the rebels raised 6,000 enthusiastic militiamen, among them John Hancock, making his debut as an Army colonel, and Lieutenant Colonel Paul Revere, now heading an artillery unit in the Massachusetts militia. The elegant French were less than impressed.
I have never seen a more laughable spectacle. All the tailors and apothecaries in the country must have been called out. They were mounted on bad nags and looked like a flock of ducks in crossbelts. Chevalier de Pontibon.
American General John Sullivan and the Comte d'Estaing agreed to synchronize their attack on Newport. The French would land 4,000 troops on the west of the island, then begin a naval bombardment. The Americans would land on the eastern side and join the French north of the city. But Sullivan jumped the gun. He saw a sudden opening in the British defenses and decided to move his men a day early without consulting d'Estaing. The French admiral was infuriated. He called the breach of plan an insult to France.
John Sullivan was a political appointee as one of the earliest general officers appointed by Congress. Many came to regret his appointment. John Adams, for example, after the Battle of New York, wrote home and said that it was a shame that the first bullet fired by the British didn't go through the head of John Sullivan that day.
As d'Estaing and Sullivan argued, 20 British warships arrived from New York. The French and British fleets spent the next 24 hours maneuvering for the favor of the wind. Before even one shot was fired, a gale struck and blew for 3 days. The fierce winds and roiling waves knocked down masts and broke off rudders. After the weather cleared, d'Estaing announced he was leaving for Boston to repair his crippled fleet. He refused to leave Sullivan any of his able ships or men. Without French naval support, the Americans began to evacuate Rhode Island. The British pursued. Some of the most furious fighting of the day took place between Hessians and the 1st Rhode Island, a newly formed regiment of 125 black soldiers. For nearly 4 hours, the 1st Rhode Island fought with what was described as a desperate valor, repelling 3 Hessian assaults. They killed or wounded nearly 5 times more men than they lost in one of the fiercest actions of the war. Throughout the Revolution, as many as 5,000 black soldiers fought with the rebels. Just as many fled to the British.
Britain saw them as Tories who could be inspired to fight for Britain and for the empire on one very simple condition, that they were offered their freedom and given that freedom in exchange for taking arms. The South was exactly the opposite. The slaveholders had very, very serious reservations about arming black people for fear they would turn their arms against their owners. The Northerners felt that they must arm black people because they had too much to do keeping the farm going to enlist, say, for long terms in the Continental troops.
By 1778, 1 in 20 of Washington's soldiers was black. This was the last integrated American army until the Korean War. The battle for Rhode Island ended in a military setback and a diplomatic blunder. Chafing old wounds dating back to the French and Indian Wars, General John Sullivan publicly blamed the French.
The French fleet's sudden departure for Boston has raised every voice against the French nation and revived all those ancient prejudices against the sincerity of that people. I do resent the conduct of the Count.
The French fleet sailed for the West Indies, taking with it the bright promise of the alliance. And for 1778, Washington's last hope for a victory. While the revolution raged up and down the Atlantic coast, another struggle was being fought at the heart of the continent, for the future of the continent, the western frontier. For years, American settlers had been pushing their way into Britain's vast lands beyond the Allegheny Mountains. In response, the British began inciting their Indian allies to attack them.
On the whole, the Native Americans, the Indian tribes, supported the British in the American Revolution because they believed that they stood a better chance of retaining their lands than if the notoriously land-hungry colonists controlled the frontier areas.
In 1778, a plan to cut off the raids was proposed by a tough red-haired explorer from Virginia, Militia Colonel George Rogers Clark. He would attack the undermanned British forts in the Northwest, present-day Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, and Illinois. If he succeeded, he would also extend Virginia's boundaries to cover an area nearly the size of Europe. On the 26th of June, Clark and 175 frontiersmen shot the rapids of the Ohio River into enemy territory. The mission was made more ominous by a total eclipse of the sun. Clark assured the men it was a good omen. Pushing them around the clock, Clark got his men to the mouth of the Tennessee River in 4 days. then led them overland to hack their way through 50 miles of forest.
George Rogers Clark, is he a great tactician? Not terribly. Is he a great planner? Not really. But he can get men to walk through swamps. He can get men to do incredible feats that they don't believe they can do themselves.
On July 4th, only 8 days after they set out, Clark and his men arrived near the British-held town of Kaskaskia in the Illinois country. Within 15 minutes, they surrounded the town's fort and took it without firing a shot. The French settlers were relieved to learn that France and America were now allies and that Clark hadn't come to kill them. 180 miles away, French settlers in the Indiana country happily greeted news of the alliance by turning over the prized fort at Vincennes to Clark's state of Virginia. To hold Vincennes, Clark sent 3 soldiers, all he could spare. Six months later, the fort was retaken by British Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton, called the hair buyer for his willingness to purchase rebel scalps. When Clark heard of the loss of Vincennes, he lamented, "I would have bound myself for 7 years a slave to have 500 troops." What he did have were 150 troops and few supplies. In the chill of February 1779, Clark began the long, hazardous trek to take back Vincennes. In places, the country was flooded 5 miles across with chest-deep, icy water. Rarely did the men wear dry clothes or sleep on dry ground. Not one deserted.
They began to think themselves superior to other men, and that neither the rivers or seasons could stop their progress. George Rogers Clark.
"17 days after setting out, Clark's small band arrived a mile from the fort. To give the illusion of several columns, Clark divided his men and, as in the biblical Battle of Jericho, told them to make as much noise as they could. Colonel Hamilton assumed some drunken locals were firing off their guns until one of his men fell from a rifle shot. The next morning, Clark demanded that Hamilton surrender immediately and unconditionally. Hamilton refused. That afternoon, Clark forced Hamilton's hand. His men had just captured an Indian raiding party, including the young Ottawa chief Makut Mong. Clark ordered the Indians tomahawked in full view of the fort. As the first warrior was killed, the others began singing their own death songs. One of the rebels turned to Makut Mong and buried the tomahawk in his skull. The chief took it out and handed it back. The executioner struck 2 more blows before killing him, while the soldiers in the fort watched.
Clark, like all great leaders, is a master showman. Hair buyer Hamilton, sitting there, being intimidated by this little display, had, of course, been paying bounties for women and children's scalps. So you're dealing in an area where both sides have dirty hands. By our standards, it's not ethical conduct. Did it work? Yeah, you bet. It bluffed him right into surrendering.
Clark was still wiping blood from his hands when he met Hamilton. The next morning, the British commander surrendered the fort. When his campaign was over, Clark had claimed for Virginia a territory more than half the size of the 13 colonies. But the land would seesaw between the British and rebels for the rest of the war. While the British were defending the Northwest, back east, they were launching the most notorious Indian raids of the war. On July 3rd, 1778, 1,000 Loyalists and Seneca Indians attacked the settlements of the Wyoming Valley in Pennsylvania. By their own account, the Indians took 227 scalps and put 1,000 houses to the torch.
During the period of the Dark Days from 1778, in a time of stalemate, the British were reduced in a sense to a sort of impotence, that the only way that they could keep the pressure up on the colonists was by a war of attrition, which meant wearing them down. And that wearing them down took the form of burning their homes, slaughtering their cattle, terrorizing their women and children, and burning the frontier ports, the coastal ports and habitations. So their warfare took a different form, a sort of guerrilla form, if you like, but of terror indiscriminately against the population.
In November, about 50 miles west of Albany, a party of Mohawk warriors and Tory Rangers descended upon Cherry Valley, New York. The town was plundered and torched. 32 men, women, and children were slaughtered, many both scalped and dismembered. For both Congress and General Washington, the massacres were the last straw. In February of 1779, Washington ordered the total destruction and devastation of the Indian settlements and the capture of as many prisoners of every age and sex as possible. The Indian country was not merely to be overrun, he said, but destroyed. The commander-in-chief committed nearly 5,000 troops to the mission. The American Army leveled more than 40 Indian towns and their fields and their orchards. 80% of the Seneca's tribal land was ravaged. Devastated, the Six Nations of the Iroquois were forced to beg food from the British that bitterly cold winter. Hundreds died of starvation and disease. Others froze to death. The Iroquois never recovered. Years later, the great Seneca chief corn planter confronted George Washington.
When your army entered the country of the Six Nations, we called you the Town Destroyer. And to this day, when that name is heard, our women look behind them and turn pale, and our children cling close to the necks of their mothers.
When France entered the war in 1778, the American Revolution ceased to be just a colonial rebellion and became a world war. Its fiercest new arena was the Caribbean. The great fortunes of 18th century Europe were built on sugar harvested in the West Indies. Here, a bitter struggle raged over this sweet crop. In 1779, Charles III of Spain joined his nephew, Louis XVI of France, against England to win control of these bountiful islands. The three great powers sailed into a thundering naval war. When the revolution began, Britain had 270 warships. America, virtually none. In the autumn of 1776, a glimmer of maritime hope appeared in the form of a one-man submarine made of oak and covered with tar, called the Turtle. Lighted within by the phosphorescent weed foxfire and propelled by a hand crank, the Turtle's mission was to screw explosives into the hulls of British ships. But the screw was designed to penetrate wood, and British ships were lined with copper. Submarine warfare would have to wait another 100 years. During the entire war, fewer than 60 ships of the American Navy ever put to sea. One congressman described the Navy as a collection of tinkers, shoemakers, and horse jockeys. There was one brilliant exception. A Scottish-born captain whose name would become as famous in international waters as in America. John Paul Jones.
He wasn't born John Paul Jones, he was born simply John Paul. And in the 1760s, unfortunately, flogged to death a ship's carpenter who had in some way or shape been insubordinate. And he was accused of murder and cleared ultimately of the charges. But in the 1770s, he once again murdered a mutinous sailor, and fearing that he would once again be charged with murder, he fled and took refuge in America, where he added the name Jones.
When the Revolution began, John Paul Jones was given a commission in the fledgling American Navy. In February 1779, he received a gift from the French, an ungainly old cargo ship, which he fitted with guns and christened Bonhomme Richard to honor Poor Richard of Benjamin Franklin's famous almanac. In mid-August, Jones sailed from France in search of British prey. On the night of September 23rd, off the coast of England, Jones came abreast of the Serapis, a 50-gun warship. As the ships opened fire, there was a deafening roar. Two of Jones' largest cannons exploded, decimating his crew. Undaunted, Jones lashed his ship to the Serapis and continued the fight with light cannons and muskets.
It became clearly apparent that the American ship was dominated by a will of the most unalterable resolution, and there could be no doubt that the intention of her commander was, if he could not conquer, to sink alongside. Captain Richard Pearson.
They just blasted away at each other. And whether John Paul Jones ever said, "I have just begun to fight," or not, you know, he was definitely on the deck shouting at the British commander. They were shouting back and forth when they could be heard. And the British commander probably decided, this guy's nuts. I'm never going to defeat him. It's just, I mean, this is just ridiculous. We're all going to end up killing each other. John Paul Jones wouldn't stop.
Finally, when the Serapis mainmast began to totter, Captain Pearson had had enough.
The captain of the Serapis gave repeated orders for one of his crew to haul down the English flag, but no one would stir to do it. They were afraid of our riflemen. The captain, therefore, ascended the quarterdeck and hauled down the very flag which he swore he would never strike to that infamous pirate, J.P. Jones. Lieutenant Nathaniel Fanning.
The fight lasted more than 3 hours. Each side lost about 150 men, almost half of each crew. The victorious Bonhomme Richard sank 2 days later, and Jones sailed away on his new ship, the Serapis. Across an ocean, Washington's army faced the greatest hardship it would ever encounter, the winter of 1779 at Morristown, New Jersey. It was a winter far harsher than the one at Valley Forge.
There were 6- and 8-foot drifts for weeks on end. The weather was the worst winter for that part of the country in recorded history. The cold got so bad that New York Harbor froze solid.
The situation of the Army with respect to supplies is beyond description. We must depend on the precarious gleanings of the neighboring country. We have never experienced a like extremity at any period. George Washington.
We were absolutely, literally starved. I do solemnly declare that I did not put a single morsel of victuals into my mouth for 4 days and as many nights, except a little black birch bark which I gnawed off a stick of wood, if that can be called victuals. I saw several men roast their old shoes and eat them. Some of the officers killed and ate a favorite little dog that belonged to one of them. Private Joseph Plum Martin.
Washington said, "We see in every line of the Army the most serious features of mutiny and sedition."
Everybody was just getting tired of the situation, you know, and it was just, I mean, it was going on interminably, and there was no light at the end of the tunnel. They weren't even fighting at that point. They were just sort of sitting, glaring at each other. So here's a bunch of men away from home. Can you imagine? Sick. I don't know how the Army stayed together. I really don't.
The monster, hunger, was not to be shaken off by any efforts we could use. The men could not stand it any longer. They saw no alternative but to starve to death or break up the army, give up, and go home. Joseph Plum Martin.
As night fell on May 25th, 2 Connecticut regiments shouldered their muskets and began to march out of camp. An officer trying to stop them was slashed with a bayonet. At this, tempers sobered, and the men returned to their huts. Once again, the rebel army had managed to survive. 1779 ended as it began, in a stalemate. But in 1780, the deadlock would be violently broken. The war would swing to the south, and a rebellion against empire would become a brutal civil war.
Likewise, I'll sell my spinning wheel to buy my love a sword of steel. Johnny has gone for a soldier. Me, oh my, I loved him so. Broke my heart to see him go, and only time can heal my woe. Johnny has gone for a soldier. I'll sell my clock, I'll sell my reel. Likewise, I'll sell my spinning